Hi there, and welcome to Her Season of Strength, where women over 40 reclaim their bodies, their energy, and their voices without apologies. I'm Kim Duffy, registered dietitian, personal trainer, mom, and your biggest hype woman when it comes to aging like you mean it. This show isn't about chasing skinny or counting wrinkles. It's about building real strength, physical, emotional, and hormonal. Each week, I'll share straight-talking nutrition tips, sustainable fitness strategies, and conversations that help you feel powerful in your skin once again. Menopause isn't an ending, it's only the beginning. This is your season of strength. Hey, welcome back to Her Season of Strength. I am so glad you're here today to discuss a topic that one of my clients asked me to cover, and that is bone health. You might say, I don't need to worry about my bones. My bones are strong. I walk every day. I drink milk, eat yogurt. What more do I need to do? Well, what if I told you that 1 in 2 women over the age of 50 will have an osteoporosis-related fracture in her lifetime? 1 in 2! That's crazy. What if I also told you that hip fractures are one of the leading causes of disability and loss of independence in older women? Would that get your attention? So today, I want to cover a few things. First, I want to talk about what is actually going on inside of your bones, because they're not this static, hard, unchanging things like that most of us picture. Then I want to discuss a little bit about kind of what are the real world consequences of bone loss that nobody really talks about. And this is the part that I really want you to stay for. I want to talk about exactly what we can do about it, because we can still do something about it. It's not just this lost cause. I want to chat a little bit about resistance training, impact, and cardio exercise, and really the specific nutrients and supplements that could make a really big difference for your bone health. So this is one of the most empowering conversations that we can have, because unlike a lot of things in our health, this is an area where your actions, they genuinely can meaningfully move the needle. So let's dive into it. So let's start at the beginning, because I think one of the biggest reasons women don't take bone health seriously enough is that we have just a completely wrong mental image of what bones actually are. So if you close your eyes for just a second, or, don't if you're driving or walking, and I don't want you to get in an accident or run into something. Picture a bone. What do you see? You see, something hard and white and kind of like what you'd find in a museum, right? Like something inert or static, something that just kind of exists. But here's the truth. Your bones are actually living. They're dynamic, and they're constantly changing tissue. They're made up of collagen, and yes, that's the same stuff we talk about for like skin and hair and nails, plus this mineral matrix that's mainly made up of calcium and phosphorus. And that gives them their structure. That gives them, what makes them rigid. And every single day, your body is breaking down old bone and building up new bone. And it's happening right now. It's while you're sitting here, this is happening. And there's 2 key players, and I promise this isn't going to be some big biology lesson, but I feel like in order for you to truly understand kind of our bone health and what our bones are doing, there's 2 players, and one are called osteo, meaning bone, blasts, and these are our bone builders, right? They're laying down new bone tissue. And then the other one is called osteoclasts, and they are your bone breakers. They dissolve and they resorb old bone. So in a healthy system, in a balanced system, these 2 teams are kind of working in harmony, right? The builders and the breakers are staying in balance. But here is where it kind of gets important for us ladies. That balance tips in your favor when you're young. So you reach what's called peak bone mass. So that's kind of the maximum density and strength that your bones will ever have. And that's somewhere in our late 20s. After that age, around 30, that process, it starts to shift, right? We're still making new bone, but those osteoclasts that are breaking down the bone, they're going to start to edge out the builders, and we begin to lose a small percentage of bone density each year, roughly 0.5% to 1% annually. And that might not sound like much. In your 30s, it isn't a crisis. But here, where menopause changes everything. Estrogen, like we've talked about and time again, how important estrogen is in the body. And I want you to really hear this. Estrogen is one of the primary signals that tells those osteoclasts, or those ones that are breaking down bone, to slow down. It's basically that, that referee keeping the bone breakers in check. Now, when our estrogen drops sharply in perimenopause and menopause, those breaks come off, and bone loss really can accelerate dramatically. We're talking like 2 to 5% per year in those first 5 to 7 years after menopause. And that can add up really fast. So here's 2 terms that are worth knowing and understanding. Osteopenia, it means that your bone density is lower than optimal, lower than it should be. It's kind of that early warning sign. Whereas osteoporosis means that your bone density has dropped significantly, and your fracture risk, that risk of you breaking a bone, is quite elevated. Neither of these is kind of your destiny. It's not a forever. It's like, oh no, I can't do anything. But you need to know they exist, and you need to know the path that leads there and the path that will, move you away from it. If you think of your bone density kind of like this bank account, right? You make your biggest deposits when you're young. And after 30, you're drawing down more than you're putting in. Or I should say withdrawing more than you're depositing, right? So our job is to keep making deposits into our bones and slow that withdrawal rate for as long as possible. So now you know what's happening. Let's talk about why the heck do we care about this? Because I want to give you kind of that real picture. I don't want to scare you, but I want to motivate you, because knowledge is power, and you deserve kind of the full picture, the full story. The most serious consequence of osteoporosis is fracture risk, right? And not just the kind where you trip and, I broke my wrist, or I sprained my ankle or something. It's that, though those things are not fun either, but hip fractures are the most common. And then there's height loss. And that surprises a lot of women. Compression fractures in our spine, those small bones of your spine or your vertebrae, can cause you to actually lose height over time. And sometimes 2, 3, or even 4 inches. It can happen really gradually. And many women don't even know it's happening until someone points it out. Related to that is what sometimes we call it kyphosis. I know that's a big word. You might know it as kind of that dowager's hump on our upper back, that forward rounding of our upper back. And it happens when the front of the vertebrae compress and the spine actually curves forward. And this is not just a cosmetic issue. When our spine curves forward like that, that can affect our breathing capacity, it can affect our digestion, it can affect our balance, and it can increase our risk of falling. And it can really, change how we're moving through the world. Not to mention, it can also cause pain. Microfractures and compression fractures in the spine can actually cause, chronic, nagging pain that can affect our sleep, and it can affect our daily life. It's kind of a quality of life issue that's, really very real for many women. Here's the thing that gets me the most about osteoporosis, though. It's called the silent thief for a reason. You feel nothing while it's happening. There's no pain, there's no alarm, no signal. The first symptom for many women is the fracture itself, which is exactly why we need to be proactive and not wait until something breaks to start paying attention. The good news, and there's lots of it, is that we know exactly what works. So let's just talk about that now, because this is where I want you to lean in. This is where we take our power back. First of all is one that, you're going to say, I hear you talk about that all the time. And if I could give you just one piece of advice for your bone health, just one thing, and it would be this. Pick up something heavy and do it consistently. Resistance training, it's the single most powerful tool we have for maintaining and building bone density in midlife and beyond. Because here's why. There's a principle in exercise science called the mechanostat. Basically, bones respond to mechanical stress by getting denser and stronger. When our muscle contracts and it pulls on our bone, think about like a squat where your quadriceps are contracting and they're loading your femur and your hip. It sends a signal to that bone, we need more here. And those osteoblasts, remember those bone builders, they're going to respond. They get to work. And the research is really solid. Studies consistently show that resistance training maintains and can actually increase bone mineral density, especially at the hip and the spine, which are those two sites where fracture risk is highest. And it's not experimental or emerging science. This is like well established. It's been replicated. So what exercises actually deliver that bone building signal? You want the big compound movements, things like squats or deadlifts, hip hinges, rows, presses, lunges. These movements load the spine and the hips most effectively, which is exactly where we need the most protection, right? These are not complicated exercises, but they do require learning proper form. And I would strongly encourage anyone who is new to these movements, work with a trainer, even just for a few sessions to just get your technique down, okay? Proper form is so important, and I don't want you injuring or hurting yourself. So then you might say, well, how often and how heavy do I need to lift? For bone benefit, you want to strength train 2 to 3 times per week. And here's the key word, progressive overload. And I know you've heard me talk about this. You need to gradually increase the resistance over time. It keeps to stimulating that bone building response. If you're doing the same weight for the same amount of repetitions month after month, your bones are going to adapt and stop responding. Our bodies are very efficient that way. So we have to kind of keep nudging that load upward, keep challenging our muscles. Now, I know some of you are thinking, Kim, I'm 50-something years old. I have no business lifting heavy things. I hear that fear and I want to address it directly. Heavy for you is not the same as dangerous for you, okay? Heavy is relative. It means challenging enough to stimulate that adaptation. And in that adaptation is where we get stronger, right? And where we build that bone. With proper form and progression that's appropriate, resistance training, it's extremely safe for women in midlife. And in fact, it is one of the most protective things you can do for your joints, for your balance, your metabolism, your bones, all those things at once. So if you're a beginner to strength training, start where you are. Resistance bands count. I have a 12-week resistance band workout on my website, and I'll drop the link in the show notes. But it's a great place to start. Not to mention, it doesn't mean that you have to buy loads of dumbbells or, build up this home gym. Basically, you can buy a set of bands, and they're amazing for getting you started. Okay? Not to mention body weight. There's so many things we can do with body weight. Body weight squats are going to count. A set of dumbbells you can do at home counts. Something is always better than nothing. You don't have to have a gym membership or a personal trainer to start building bone. You just need to start doing something. Okay? And you need to be doing something consistent and progressive. So next I want to talk a little bit about cardio, because I know a lot of you have a cardio routine you love. And I want to give you an honest picture of how different types of cardio actually affect your bones. So you can make kind of informed decisions and choices and build just that well-rounded, complete strategy. So first of all, impact and plyometric training. This is one that surprises people. When you jump, when your foot hits the ground, that ground reaction force, it sends this powerful mechanical signal through your bones, especially your hip bones. Research on plyometric training shows significant improvements in hip bone density, and some really interesting studies show that even simple jumping, just 10 to 20 hops a day can improve your hip bone density in pre- and perimenopausal women. It doesn't have to be some major full jump training program. It can be as simple as hopping in place for like 30 seconds while you're waiting for your coffee to brew. I incorporate in plyometrics in all of my training sessions. And I know I've had some new clients coming in, women who I have not, jumped or hopped since I was in elementary school. So they say, this seems odd. You're having me skip or jump, and it can be very challenging, very hard. Like they're not used to it and their body isn't, leaving the ground. And it is amazing to me how much better, how much more adept they get at, how much it helps their balance, but also how it helps with their bone health. So now I want to just touch on walking, because walking is wonderful. Walking is great for your cardiovascular system, your blood sugar, your mental health, your longevity. I love walking, and I believe it's a wonderful thing to incorporate in with a more advanced program, but it is low impact activity. It has relatively modest effects on bone density compared to resistance training or those higher impact activities. So if walking is your primary form of exercise, don't give it up. That's not what I'm saying, but don't rely on it as your bone health strategy. Jogging and running provide more meaningful impact loading than walking. Those ground forces are higher and the hip and spine do benefit. If you're a runner, great, but just be mindful of injury risk if you're ramping up from nothing. Now let's touch on cycling and swimming, because I know so many of you love these activities. They're wonderful. They're joint friendly. They're great for our cardiovascular system, our mood, our stress levels. I'm absolutely not telling you to give them up, but here's the truth. Both cycling and swimming are non-weight-bearing activities. Your bones are not going to be loaded against gravity, and that means they're not going to provide much direct bone-building stimulus. So if cycling or swimming is your main form of cardio, I want you to hear this clearly. Your bike and your pool are your friends, just not your bones' best friends. So pair them with a good resistance training program and maybe a little bit of plyometrics or some jumping, and you've got a beautifully complete approach to your health. So you knew we were going to be getting here eventually. Let's talk about food and supplements, because what you eat is absolutely foundational to bone health. And there's a lot of noise and confusion out there about this topic. I want to kind of cut through that and just give you a little bit of practical information that you can actually use. First of all, calcium. Let's start with that obvious one. It is the primary mineral in bone, and most women, especially women over 40, are not getting enough of it. Women over 50 need about 1,200 milligrams per day. Now, before you run out and you buy a giant calcium supplement, hear me out. Food first is always the goal, right? The best food sources of calcium are going to be dairy, like yogurt, cheese, and milk. They're going to be the most bioavailable sources, so the best absorbed. So if you do dairy, fantastic. Lean into it. Some other sources are going to be like canned salmon, sardines with those little bones. Those help to give us calcium. You can also get tofu that's made with calcium sulfate. Just look at the label. There's also fortified plant-based milks, leafy greens like kale and bok choy, although the calcium in these is not quite as well absorbed, especially in spinach. Okay, your body doesn't absorb the calcium that's in there as well. So one important thing to note on timing of calcium supplementation is your body can only absorb about 500 milligrams of calcium at one time efficiently, right? So spread your intake, especially if you're doing a supplement, spread your intake throughout the day rather than taking it all at one time. A supplement, you might take a supplement in the morning, maybe you have a serving of dairy at lunch, maybe you have some greens at dinner, something like that. That's a better strategy for your calcium intake than one big dose all at once. Next is vitamin D. You cannot absorb calcium without vitamin D. It's kind of the gatekeeper. It regulates the calcium absorption in your gut And without adequate levels, all calcium in the world is going to do you very little good. So the problem is that very few foods contain meaningful amounts of vitamin D. Fatty fish like salmon, mackerel, sardines are the main food sources. Egg yolks have a little bit in there. You'll have other foods that are fortified, but realistically, most women need to supplement vitamin D. A reasonable starting point, I usually recommend 2,000 to 4,000 IUs daily. But I usually tell women to have their vitamin D levels checked first, because if you are deficient, if your levels are much lower than that, you might need to be supplementing higher amounts, right? And if you're living, like me, you're living up here in Minnesota in the Great White North, you're going to need higher amounts in the wintertime when you're not getting that sunshine. And that's where that 2,000 to 4,000, I usually recommend 4,000 IUs in the wintertime, 2,000 in the summer. But like I said, we're going to base that off of your actual lab values, and if you do have a deficiency or not. Next is protein, and that's kind of one that surprises people. I know you hear me talk about protein all the time, but protein is critically important for bone health. If you'll remember that collagen makes up about 30% of our bone matrix, it's that framework that the minerals attach to. So without adequate protein, we can't build and maintain that framework. And protein also helps us to build the muscle mass that pulls on that bone and stimulates that bone building. So for women in midlife, we aim for 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. If you're not tracking, just make sure you have a solid protein source at every single meal. Usually I recommend at least 25 to 30 grams of protein per meal. That would be like, have some eggs at breakfast, chicken or fish at lunch, Greek yogurt as a snack. Maybe you have some kind of lean protein at dinner, some beans and legumes. And, that protein in and of itself is one of the most impactful nutritional changes that women can make. The next mineral is magnesium. It's kind of that supporting player. It doesn't get a lot of credit, but it works right alongside calcium and vitamin D. And deficiency is surprisingly common. Many women are low without even knowing it. You can get good sources of magnesium in your nuts and seeds, your beans and legumes, your whole grains, and then also those dark leafy greens. But if you're not eating these regularly, you might want to consider a magnesium supplement, usually a magnesium glycinate at bedtime or a magnesium citrate, just depending on what you're looking for, and if you have any kind of issues with constipation or diarrhea, you want to make sure you're using the proper magnesium form, or else it can challenge those things, right? Next is vitamin K2, and this is one that I don't think a lot of women know, because this is one that I always talk about when I'm doing a nutritional assessment with a client for the first time. We talk about vitamin D, but also vitamin D with K2. Vitamin K2, it does something remarkable. It directs calcium into your bones and away from your arteries. So think of it as that traffic controller that makes sure that the calcium ends up where it belongs. Because we don't want it in our arteries. We don't want it forming plaques in our arteries, right? So there's food sources of vitamin K2, and that would be like natto, which is a fermented soybean product, popular in Japan, but not a lot of people in the United States know or eat a lot of it. You can also get it in sauerkraut and certain aged cheeses. The MK7 form of K2 supplement, it's the most bioavailable, just meaning the most absorbable, and the form that I usually recommend. But one thing to remember, if you're on blood thinners like Coumadin or warfarin, you're going to want to make sure to talk to your doctor before you supplement with K2, because it can interact with that medication. Okay. So now let's talk about what to limit when it comes to bone health, and that is excessive sodium intake, because that excessive sodium can cause calcium to actually leach out through your urine. Also, heavy alcohol consumption can disrupt our bone remodeling, and very high caffeine intake can slightly reduce calcium absorption. Now, none of these need to be completely eliminated. It's not about perfection. It's about balance and awareness, right? So let's bring all of this home here, because I want you to walk away from this episode with just a little more clarity on what to do next. So today we talked about how your bones are alive, right? And they're always responding to the stress you put on them, to the food you're eating and to the hormones moving in your body. Bone loss begins in our 30s and accelerates significantly after menopause. And while, that's real and that's important fact, it's not a sentence. It's information, and it's information for us is fuel, right? So your 4-pillar bone building action plan, and you can write this down if you're, somewhere where you can actually write. 1, lift weights. 2 to 3 times a week, compound movements using progressive overload. This is a non-negotiable for your bones. And everybody can be doing this to some degree. Now, you might have to, you might say, but I can't do it on my shoulders, or I can't do squats, or I can't do lunges. There is something that you can do, and I've talked about that before many times in the past episodes. Number 2, add impact. If you can, jump, hop, jog. Even 10 to 20 hops a day can give your hip bones a stimulus. You don't need a whole, plyometrics program. Just start adding a little impact to your day. 3, eat for your bones. Protein at every meal, calcium-rich foods spread throughout the day, magnesium-rich greens and nuts and seeds, and know your vitamin D status and supplement if you need that. 4, consider vitamin K2. Talk to your doctor, make sure that, you're not on any blood thinners that it can affect. But that is one you can do, a vitamin D3 plus K2 supplement. And get a DEXA scan. That's a DEXA scan if you haven't had one, because this is a wonderful way to know what your bones are looking like. Do you have any current osteopenia or osteoporosis? It's going to look at all the kind of important parts in your hips and your spine, even comparing one side to the other. And you want a baseline so that you can trend it, so you can watch it. So maybe you get one at 50, then maybe you get another one at 55 and 60, and just make sure that you're not seeing any significant progress towards osteopenia or osteoporosis. And please hear this, it's never too late to start. The research is beautiful on this. Women in their 60s and 70s who begin resistance training still see meaningful improvements in their bone density. It's never too late. You didn't miss your window. Your window is right now. So whatever season of life you're in, whatever starting point you're at, I want you to take one thing from this episode and do it this week, just one. Maybe you schedule that bone density scan. Maybe you add some squats to your routine. Maybe you start putting a little Greek yogurt on your grocery list, throwing it in your smoothies. One thing. That's all it takes to start. And if this episode added any, value to your life, if you learned a little something, if it motivated you, if it made you feel like you've got this, just take 30 seconds and follow the show wherever you listen to podcasts. It makes such a difference in helping this community of women grow. And share this episode with a woman in your life who needs to hear it. Your best friend, your sister, your mom, your coworker, who keeps saying she should probably do something about her bones. Just send it to her. Literally right now, drop it into text. She'll thank you, and so will I. And remember, this is about progress over perfection. We're in this for the long haul, and this is your season of strength. Have an amazing day.